Commander Ray Mercer stood on the bridge of the ESS Titan Blade, her hands gripping the controls as her eyes scanned the dark expanse of space. The mission was simple: intercept a pirate cruiser operating in the Varnak expanse and bring it to justice. Ray was used to high-risk missions, but today felt different. There was something unsettling about the silence that surrounded them as they approached the pirate ship. The Titan Blade was one of Earth's most advanced warships, equipped with all the latest technology. The pirate ship, a ragtag collection of scavenged vessels welded together, didn't stand a chance. The crew was ready, the weapons were charged, and Ray was prepared to get the job done. Without warning, a massive surge of energy shot out from the pirate cruiser. It was unlike anything Ray had seen before, a pulsating beam of purple lightning that crackled through the void, twisting the very fabric of space around it. Ray's heart skipped a beat as her mind raced. The pirate ship was clearly using some kind of illegal experimental technology, but it was far more dangerous than anything they had prepared for. "Brace for impact!" she shouted to her crew. But it was too late. The energy from the pirate ship erupted in an uncontrolled burst, sending shock waves throughout space, and in the blink of an eye, everything went black. The Titan Blade lurched violently, and Ray was thrown from her seat, crashing to the floor. She blinked, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling. When she opened her eyes, the ship was no longer in the familiar space of the Varnak expanse. Around her, there was nothing but swirling chaos, a storm of stars, torn fragments of debris, and strange, shifting lights. Something had happened. They were no longer where they had been. Ray scrambled to her feet, her head pounding. "Status report!" she barked, wiping the blood from her forehead. She staggered toward the command console, her vision blurry, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. She saw it first on the screen, a form, like a shadow, standing in the center of the bridge. It was enormous, easily twice her size, and the dark shape glowed with strange, shifting markings across its body. It wasn't human. She could feel the presence in her mind, a cold, alien force that made her skin crawl. Ray's breath hitched. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and then, in her mind, she heard a voice. "You are not me." The voice was deep, calm, and it sent a chill down Ray's spine. She stumbled back, her heart racing. "Who said that?" she whispered, panic rising in her chest. The voice didn't respond directly, but the presence of the figure seemed to loom even larger. Then something strange happened. She felt it again. Another voice, this one more familiar but somehow also foreign. "I am Orkal of the Sivaran. Warden, this is not my body. What have you done, human?" Ray's mind raced. Svaran Warden? She had heard of the Svaran, a brutal ancient warrior species, known across the galaxy for their fearsome battles and their cold, calculating ways. But the words didn't make sense. Why would a Sivaran be inside her ship? Why could she hear his thoughts in her mind? The more she tried to understand, the more confused she became. The ship's alarm suddenly blared to life, and Ray quickly snapped back to reality. The Titan Blade was heavily damaged, and the surrounding area was filled with wreckage from the pirate cruiser, now destroyed by the energy burst. As Ray tried to steady herself, she realized that the damage to the ship was extensive. The rift had torn the fabric of space itself, pulling both the Titan Blade and the pirate ship into unknown territory. They were no longer in the Varnak expanse. They had crossed into an unfamiliar, dangerous realm. Ray's mind raced again, but this time, it was different. The voice of Orkal was no longer just a whisper. It was stronger, clearer. His thoughts were intertwining with hers, and she could no longer distinguish her own from his. They were somehow connected. Strangers, enemies even, linked by an accident that had changed everything. And in that strange, shared space between their minds, the terror of the unknown began to sink in. The galaxy around them was full of threats. But what had happened to them? What was growing in the shadows? Was something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. One thing was clear. They were no longer alone. And what lay ahead would test the limits of both their minds and their bodies. Ray and Orcal found themselves in a strange and uneasy silence after the accident, their minds still linked by the rift that had torn through the fabric of space. Ray gritted her teeth as she worked through the damage on the Titan blade, her fingers moving quickly across the control panels as she assessed the situation. Her ship was broken, barely functional, and the wreckage of the pirate cruiser floated nearby, twisted and charred. As she tried to focus on the task at hand, Orcal's presence filled her mind once again, his thoughts so loud and clear that it felt as though he was standing right next to her. I do not understand what has happened. This was not supposed to be possible. His voice echoed in her head, heavy with confusion and fear. Ray had to fight to steady her breath. She knew about the Savaran, their cold warrior nature, their reputation for being as unyielding as the stars themselves. But never in her wildest imagination did she think she'd end up trapped in his mind, sharing his thoughts, his fears. They were strangers. Enemies by all accounts. And now they were bound together in a way that neither of them could control. For a long moment, Ray just stared at the control panel, trying to make sense of it all. The rift had caused a kind of cosmic accident, one that linked their minds in an inexplicable way. She could feel his anger, his confusion, and even his shame at the weakness he felt in this alien body. "You should not be here. I am not meant to share this with you." Orcal's voice rang out in her mind, his tone laced with frustration. Ray gritted her teeth, her hands shaking as she tried to focus. She had never felt so alone before. Alone, but not. She was never truly alone. "You need to focus. We have to survive," she shot back, her words harsh, sharp as she spoke them aloud. In that moment, something shifted. It was subtle, but it was enough. Orcal's voice became quieter, not in anger but in understanding. His mind began to sync with hers in a way that felt almost like an instinct. He wasn't just a separate presence anymore. He was becoming part of her, filling the empty spaces where her own thoughts had been. They had to figure out a way to fix the ships, to communicate with their respective commands. Both their vessels were stuck in the middle of nowhere, lost, in a vast region of space neither of them understood. But as Ray tried to work through the repairs, something new happened. Orcal's memories started to flood her mind. His experiences, his life. They were like ghostly whispers, flickering, in and out of focus, like fragmented dreams she couldn't escape. She saw images of his homeworld, a beautiful, yet brutal place where survival was a constant struggle. She felt the weight of his duty, the responsibility he carried as a warden of his people. She understood the fierce loyalty that ran through his veins, a loyalty that had bound him to a code that was so strict, so unyielding, it had cost him everything. She felt his loss, the faces of his fallen comrades, his failures, and the crushing weight of his past decisions. Ray's heart tightened as she felt the loneliness that seemed to define his every thought. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but there was no time. "We need to move. There's something else out there," she said, her voice grim. Orcal's thoughts aligned with hers immediately. He didn't need her to explain. He knew. The two of them, now bound by the accident, had begun to understand each other in ways words could never describe. Out in the depths of space, something was stirring. A signal, faint but unmistakable, pulsed through the darkness. Ray could feel it, even as Orkal's mind echoed the same recognition. It was a call, a message from the past, one that neither of them could ignore. "The Krill Hive," Orkal muttered in her mind, his voice filled with a deep, resonating fear. Ray didn't need him to explain further. She knew. The Krill were a nightmare, a ruthless, parasitic species that consumed entire worlds, their minds collective, singular, unrelenting. They were thought to be extinct, wiped out centuries ago by a combined galactic effort. But now, somehow, they had returned, and Ray and Orkal were the first to encounter them. The connection between them, born from an accident, had placed them at the center of a war neither had expected. They weren't just facing death from the Krill, they were facing it together, their minds forever intertwined. The galaxy was on the brink of disaster, and Ray and Orkal were the only ones who knew. The Titan blade drifted in space, damaged and barely functional. Ray stood in front of the broken console, staring at the flickering lights that barely kept the ship together. The Krill Hive's presence loomed over them like a shadow, growing closer, with each passing minute. Ray could feel Orkal's thoughts pressing into her mind, the alien's fear and determination merging with her own. The link between them had become stronger over time, and now it felt as if they were one. Two minds in a shared struggle to survive. Ray could hear the cold, calculated thoughts of Orkal, his memories of the Krill flooding her mind. They were a terrifying species, a hive collective that could overwhelm entire planets with their numbers and mind-bending power. The Krill didn't just conquer, they consumed. They were relentless, a force of nature that had left nothing but ruins in their wake. Ray understood now why Orkal was so afraid. The Krill were not just a threat, they were an extinction-level danger, and they were closing in fast. With the Titan blade crippled and the pirate ship wreckage nearby, Ray had no way to warn the rest of the fleet, no way to call for help. The closest human force was light years away, and there was no guarantee they'd get there in time. Ray knew they had to act quickly if they were going to survive. The first step was to get the ship operational. Again. But the damage was extensive. The engines were offline, and the weapons systems were only half-powered. Ray's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan as she felt Orkal's thoughts moving alongside hers, like a shadow in her mind. It was almost as if he was reading her thoughts, understanding her strategies before she even spoke them. "We must survive first," Orkal's voice echoed in her mind, calm yet firm. "Then we fight." Ray could feel the strength in his words, and it gave her a spark of hope. Orkal had been through countless battles, and he was a warrior of unmatched skill. The Sivaran were known for their tactical genius, and Ray realized that despite their differences, he could help her think through the problem. Together, they might be able to outwit the Krill. Working together, Ray and Orkal began to piece together a plan. She would repair the ship's engines, using the limited resources available. Orkal would guide her through the intricacies of the Titan blades systems, sharing his knowledge of battle tactics and defensive strategies. As they worked in sync, Ray couldn't help but feel the strange connection between them. It was as if they were two parts of the same whole. Orkal's thoughts flowed into hers, guiding her every step of the way. The human in her wanted to fight against the invasion of her mind, but the strategist in her understood that this connection was their only chance. They could use it. They had to use it. Time was running out. The Krill were getting closer, and the Titan blade was still not ready for a fight. Ray's hands flew over the console, repairing damaged circuits and rerouting power. The ship groaned and hummed under her touch, but it was a far cry from the sleek warship it had once been. The Krill were coming, and they had no time to waste. As the ship's power systems came back online, Orkal's presence surged in her mind again. I have an idea, he thought, his voice strong and steady. Ray's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what Orkal had in mind, but she trusted him. If they were going to stand a chance, they needed to think outside the box. The Krill wouldn't attack head-on. They would wait. They would strategize. But Ray and Orkal could outsmart them. Together, they began to formulate a daring plan. Ray would use the Titan Blade's remaining weapons to create a decoy signal, tricking the Krill into thinking the ship was still inoperable. Orkal would guide her in creating a false trail, leading the Krill into a trap. The plan was risky. If it failed, they would be destroyed. But it was their best chance. Ray knew that without this move, they wouldn't survive long enough to fight back. They had one shot. As the decoy signal came online and the ship began to move into position, Ray felt her heart racing. The weight of the mission, the lives at stake, pressed heavily on her chest. Orkal's presence was now a constant, a force that kept her grounded, as they prepared for the fight of their lives. The Krill were coming, but Ray and Orkal had a plan, and, for the first time since the accident, Ray felt like they might have a chance. Ray and Orkal stood at the edge of a precipice, the final, moments before their desperate plan was put into action. The Titan Blade, though still crippled, was moving into position. The decoy signal, a false transmission that made it appear as though the ship was on its last legs, had been sent into the void, and now they had to wait. The Krill were closing in, and Ray could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the tension in her body making every second feel like an eternity. Orkal's presence in her mind was stronger than ever, his cold, calculating thoughts now perfectly in sync with her own. The alien's mind had become both a strength and a burden, as the weight of their connection was undeniable. At times, it felt like they were two halves of the same entity, an entity bound by survival and the shared desire to defeat the approaching threat. Orkal was the warrior, the tactician who knew how to fight, how to survive, while Ray was the impulsive strategist driven by sheer will to protect the ones she loved. Together they had become something greater than the sum of their parts. The minutes ticked by, and every fiber of Ray's being screamed at her to take action. But she had to trust in the plan. In the distance, the faint shimmer of the Krill fleet began to materialize, their ships massive and terrifying, moving in perfect coordination. They were a swarm, a collective, and Ray knew that they were about to unleash their full fury. They are not foolish, Orkal's voice whispered. In her mind, as though reading her thoughts, they will wait until they are sure. But they will not wait long. The Spharan's words were cold and unwavering, a reminder of the stakes they faced. Ray took a steadying breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. She knew the Krill would not hesitate to destroy them if they realized the Titan Blade was still capable of fighting back. Their strategy depended entirely on the element of surprise. If the Krill believed they were weak, they might lower their guard. That was their opening. The next few minutes would decide everything. As the Krill ships drew closer, Ray could feel her grip tightening on the controls. She wasn't sure how much time they had left, but she knew they needed to act fast. Orkal's mind merged with hers, as though they were one. She could feel his focus, his discipline, his intense drive. Together they began to push the Titan Blade forward. It was a gamble. The ship was slow, the decoy signal was unstable, and the Krill could turn on them at any moment. But they had no choice. They moved toward the heart of the approaching fleet, their ship seemingly helpless. The Krill ships began to adjust their course, following the signal, unaware of the trap that was being set. Ray's heart raced as she heard Orkal's voice in her mind once more. Now! Strike now! It was time. With a flash of motion, Ray slammed her hand onto the activation panel. The Titan blade surged forward, its remaining weapons flaring to life in an instant. The Krill ships, taken completely by surprise, were momentarily stunned. For those few precious seconds, the Titan blade was no longer the vulnerable target it appeared to be. Ray and Orkal worked in perfect synchrony, launching a barrage of fire at the closest Krill ships. The blast ripped through the enemy fleet, tearing apart their formation in a flash of chaotic explosions. The Krill responded quickly, their ships retaliating with devastating force. But Ray and Orkal were already on the move. They used the Titan blade's damaged systems to their advantage, weaving through the debris and avoiding the enemy's fire, with the kind of precision that only came from a deep, unspoken understanding. As the battle raged on, Ray felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The chaos of battle was everywhere, but she and Orkal were a singular force, a perfect unit. The connection between them had become a weapon as powerful as any starship or weapon in the galaxy. The fight was far from over. The Krill were ruthless, and they were relentless. But Ray and Orkal weren't backing down. They fought with a desperation that only those with nothing left to lose could understand. In those few moments of action, they managed to take down several Krill ships, but they knew that the real battle was yet to come. The swarm was closing in, and the odds were still stacked against them. Ray's pulse was wild, her mind racing. But Orkal was there, every step of the way. His presence was a grounding force that kept her focused. Together, they were more than just survivors. They were fighters, and the Krill were learning that the hard way. In that moment, with the stars flickering above and the sound of weapons fire reverberating through the cold vacuum of space, Ray and Orkal realized they weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for something much greater, for the chance to win. The battle against the Krill had escalated into chaos, and Ray felt the full weight of the situation pressing on her. Despite their earlier successes, the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and the Titan blade was taking heavy damage. Every blast from the Krill ships shook the hull, rattling the crew and making the walls groan. The connection between Ray and Orkal had become their greatest strength. Through their shared thoughts, they were able to anticipate each other's moves, almost as if they were one mind working together to defeat the enemy. The bond between them had deepened with every passing moment, and Ray could feel Orkal's resolve, his unyielding determination. He was a warrior of incredible skill, and though he had never been part of a human crew before, his instincts were sharp, his strategies effective. They fought like one, and that unity was their best weapon. As the battle continued, the Krill began to regroup, their ships adjusting their tactics. It became clear to Ray that they were adapting to the Titan blade's movements. The enemy ships formed a new formation, a tight, nearly impenetrable circle that closed in on them, cutting off their escape routes. Ray could feel the weight of their strategy. The Krill were trying to trap them. Ray's thoughts raced. The Titan blade was strong, but it was not invincible. They couldn't keep up with this level of attack for long. The decoy signal they had used earlier was starting to fade, and the Krill were no longer fooled. They knew the Titan blade was still a threat. In that moment of realization, Ray understood that the only way to survive was to use their last card, their desperation. She could feel Orkal's mind aligning with hers, sensing the same need for a bold move. They needed to break free, and the only way to do that was to lure the Krill into an even more dangerous trap. Ray, trusting Orkal's tactical expertise, made a quick decision. They would abandon the decoy and go on the offensive. Orkal's voice echoed in her mind, clear and commanding. We need to force them to overextend, give them the illusion of victory, and then strike when they are at their weakest. It was a dangerous gamble. If they failed, they would be crushed. But Ray felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let the Krill win, not while she was alive. With no Time to waste. Ray altered the ship's trajectory, moving the Titan blade into the center of the Krill formation, as though they were surrendering. The Krill responded as expected, sending their ships in to finish them off. But Ray and Orcal weren't finished yet. In that critical moment, they turned the ship's damaged engines into a weapon. The ship lurched forward, skidding at an unexpected angle, and a series of weapons fired in quick succession, catching the Krill ships off guard. They had underestimated the Titan blade once again. The ships nearest to them were thrown into disarray, and in that split second, Ray saw their opportunity. With a powerful burst of energy, the Titan blade broke through the weakening Krill formation, narrowly avoiding a devastating hit. But their escape was short-lived. The Krill regrouped quickly, launching wave after wave of attacks. Ray could feel the strain on the ship, but she refused to give in. Orcal's presence was like an anchor, steadying her, helping her focus. The connection between them had become so strong that it was no longer just about survival. It was about victory. As the battle raged on, Ray's mind began to merge even further with Orcal's. They were no longer just allies. They were one in purpose, one in strategy. The intensity of the battle left Ray breathless, but there was no time for hesitation. The Titan blade was beginning to falter. They had to take the fight to the Krill, to show them that humanity's strength was not to be underestimated. With one final daring move, Ray and Orcal pushed the Titan blade to its limits. They launched a coordinated attack that struck deep into the heart of the Krill formation, hitting them where they were most vulnerable. The explosions were deafening, the sheer force of the blast shaking the stars themselves. For a moment there was a silence. Then, the Krill fleet began to retreat, their ships scattering in every direction. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. The Titan blade had held its ground. Ray's chest heaved with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this fight. And in that victory, Ray realized something. The bond between her and Orcal had turned the tide. They had faced the impossible and emerged stronger, united not just by their minds, but by their resolve. No matter what came next, they knew they could face it together. Ray and Orcal stood together, feeling the weight of their actions and the aftermath of their hard-fought battle. The Krill had retreated, but the cost of their victory was not lost on them. The Titan blade was barely functional, its hull scorched and punctured, its systems flickering with failing power. Ray felt the tension of the situation in her every muscle, the exhaustion from the battle making her limbs feel like lead. Yet, there was a strange sense of accomplishment in the air. They had done it. They had held their ground against an overwhelming enemy. As the stars outside the ship twinkled, Ray couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. She and Orcal had faced the impossible, and together they had won. But it wasn't just the victory that had changed them. It was the bond they now shared. Through the intense battle and the life-or-death moments, their minds had fused into something deeper than just a simple connection. It was as though they were no longer two separate beings. Ray could sense Orcal's thoughts, his emotions, his resolve, as clearly as if they were her own. She could feel his strength, his unwavering commitment to the mission, and the pride he took in their shared victory. It was a strange and powerful feeling, one that transcended anything she had ever experienced before. Despite the sense of victory, Ray knew that the war was far from over. The Krill were not easily deterred, and the battle they had just fought would only be one of many in the long conflict ahead. Still, she felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished. They had done more than just survive. They had fought back, and they had done so with ingenuity, strength, and unity. The enemy may have underestimated humanity, but they would learn that humans were not so easily defeated. Ray glanced at the console, watching as the damage report continued to scroll across the screen. The Titan blade was in rough shape, but it was still operational. They had pulled off the impossible, but they were going to need repairs, and fast. The crew, though battered and weary, had survived. The connection between Ray and Orcal had given them the strength to keep going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As she stood there with the hum of the ship's damaged systems in the background, Ray realized something. The connection with Orcal, the shared bond, was not just about survival. It was about something much greater, something that could change the course of the war. Together, they had proven that even against impossible odds, humanity could find a way to fight back. They had fought as individuals, yes, but also as one. In that unity, there was power. Orcal's voice echoed in Ray's mind, calm and steady as ever. This battle is just the beginning. The Krill will return, and others will come as well. But we are not alone anymore. Ray nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest. The fight was far from over, and they would face more challenges ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. The bond they shared, the connection between their minds, would be their greatest weapon in the battles to come. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a future, for humanity, for the chance to prove that they could stand up to any threat, no matter how powerful. As the ship drifted into the quiet void of space, Ray felt a sense of determination welling up inside her. They had come this far, and together, with Orcal by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The Krill might have retreated, for now, but Ray had no doubt that humanity's true strength had only just begun to show. Their minds were linked, their hearts aligned in purpose, and that was a force the galaxy would not be able to ignore. The war was far from over, but humanity had found its strength in unity, and with that strength, they would fight on.